Welcome everyone. I'm Ania Molenda and this is Cristina Ampatzidou. We are both founders and the editors of Amateur Cities, which we started more or less 2 years ago. I come from here. I was born and raised in Wrocław, but we both met in Rotterdam during our studies when we both worked then still as students for the student newspaper of the TU Delft. And years after graduation, we met again, and we decided we wanted to create a platform together that would focus on publishing and that would create a different sense of discourse in architecture that would focus more on creating insight across disciplines and how architecture relates to these disciplines instead of focusing purely on images and the singular architectural objects, so to say. Today we're going to present a short lecture. It's, again, not really something that we have clearly defined. It's more a set of observations and questions, which we hope we will be able to address later on in a discussion. And it's related to making and the right to the city. And Cristina is gonna start the presentation.
Great, thank you, welcome. So it was already said before that the 19th century and the Industrial Revolution basically defined the consumerist society of like the 20th century. And not only in the sense that it created these like new landscapes of production, but it also created a lot of infrastructure to support this production and the transportation of objects, but also a huge movement of population from agricultural and rural areas into the cities to become workers and to gradually form this new class of consumers. So as this whole transformation has been taking on, the scale of production has grew in unprecedented proportions, and it also created an economic system that is like based on the accumulation and reinvestment of surplus capital, and that means that it constantly has to move around in search for like lower wages, cheaper raw material, and like processes that basically can facilitate this reproduction. So I think closely related to this idea of like over-consumerism and the transformation in the post-war society, I think also a little bit like anticipating the advent of neoliberalism later on. There was this idea of like French philosopher, the right to the city, like of Lefebvre, the right to the city, that was basically phrased as a demand for a transformed and renewed access to urban life. So it was basically from its very beginning, it was related to this idea of production and how production is linked to processes of urbanization, and how these processes should be how there should be much more like inclusive in terms of how the citizens can affect them. David Harvey, he has developed this concept further by saying basically that the right to the city, it's a collective right, it's not an individual right, and it's a very much prominent right to change ourselves by changing the city, meaning that the possibility to influence collectively, like through the exercise of collective power of the processes of urbanization, which he sees as the main mechanism of getting rid of surplus capital. So a direct consequence of this is, of course, the offshoring of manufacturing from like the Western world, mostly to the East, that has had basically no impact to the amount of stuff we consume. Like we don't consume less because we lost these jobs. Like we didn't change our habits at all. It has only influenced the composition of how we make our living. Right now, in Europe, almost 75% of the GDP is it depends on the service sector. So, of course, this not only creates a certain dependency on from where our material stuff is coming from, but it is also basically like influencing the way that we relate to the products that we use. Anna talked in the beginning about this like disconnection between design and production, and I think it very much relates to this, that we see when we are aware that these objects are coming from somewhere else, this like relationship that we create with them is totally distorted. So I think it's that the maker movement could perhaps be a way to readdress this disconnection, and that's a little bit like what our presentation is going to be about.
So we had in a few other presentations already a brief introduction to what the maker movement is, but it's a huge umbrella. It involves a lot of different terms, a lot of different processes. But it focuses on the idea of bringing the more individualized production back into the city, but that also relates to certain, let's say, pool of values that are related to open access to information, to learning, sharing, collaboration, and so on and so forth, which have a certain positive potential. But I think further in this discussion, we also want to look at the, let's say, more complex aspects and how they relate back to the larger processes that are also happening in the city. So this is, the maker movement in general is, as Justina already mentioned, it's a growing movement. There is more and more people getting engaged in it. There are locations, there are specific stores where you can get stuff. There are places where you can access the machinery. There are a lot of conferences, events, publications that relate to that. So it's almost becoming an industry on its own, and it seems to be presented and in a way hailed that way, that it has the potential to become the next industrial revolution. But so there is a lot of knowledge being produced around it. There is a lot of hype around it. But I think the maker movement is questioning this idea of production that we can associate with this kind of image, when we bring this personal relationship by a very shallow kind of customization, that you can choose the color of the fabric of your shoe, or like if we bring it into the architectural scale, that you can use this kind of architectural components to build something that is going to create a structure. So the maker movement is addressing that and questioning that, and it does bring a lot of positive examples with itself. So one of them is, for instance, the application of prosthetic arms that are 3D printed, which are making, thanks to this technology, this very necessary help to people for a very low price. And prosthetic arms are very necessary, but at the same time very expensive, and they need to be replaced very frequently. And that makes them inaccessible to quite a large amount of people. And with the technology of 3D printing, instead of having the price of 5,000 to 50,000 euro, you can bring this price down to 50, which I think is bringing a considerable change to these people's lives. Another example that we think is quite positive is the example that Justyna presented before, which is the Wiki House, which taken the fact that it's fast, light, open source, accessible, it can be used for many situations where quick assembly of emergency housing is needed, provided that there is the possibility to attach all sorts of necessary media to it in an equally fast way. And I think what is really important to address in that sense is that the maker movement is bringing the idea of freedom and open source, but it's also like bringing a different sense of ownership that allows us to have a different sense of attachment to the to not only to the object but also to the larger environment, and that it's we should look at it also in a more broader social spectrum. What particularly on the scale of software is very important is that the maker movement is associated with this idea: if you can't open it, you don't own it, which should make us think about how are we using our technology. We very quickly accepted the fact that when we buy a device, the software that comes with it, we don't actually own. We license it, which also at the same time can make this device completely useless. And this is an example of a Dutch social enterprise. It's called the Fairphone. And it addresses exactly this question, trying to introduce a technology that is composed out of elements that can be freely assembled and changed and repaired, and the manufacturer is actually encouraging the users to do that instead of throwing away that device and replacing it with a new one. But we still don't really see the actual translation of all of these ideas into a larger scale. The biggest scale addressed right now is the scale of the individual house. On one hand, with the Wiki House that we already talked about. Another example is this 3D printed canal house by Dus in the Netherlands. And another example, for instance, are these 3D printed houses in China. There are very different approaches. One is, let's say, in the case of Dus, a more design-oriented approach, which is addressing this idea of making a beautiful facade. And this is, let's say, the mass-produced example, which is making this architecture accessible, fast, like cheaply and fastly produced. But at the same time, we can pose a lot of questions about the quality of it and whether this is actually the way that we are giving ourselves the right and the chance to decide about how, what kind of living environments are we going to construct.
So basically the question becomes like, okay, there are all these technologies, they are giving these amazing possibilities. Like, how are we using them? Like, how do we use them to claim a right to the city? And I think that brings to the other side. I was preparing this presentation. We were reading this review of an exhibition that featured the WikiHouse project, and then there was this excerpt that says that the WikiHouse is an example of open source design, free designs that we usually expect to pay for. It makes designing a house as simple as planning a new kitchen on the IKEA website, more or less. And for me, this sentence sort of shows everything that is wrong about these things. And the first one is that it basically says that open source design, it means that you're not supposed to pay for. So it kind of implies that all these people are working to develop something that you can access for free. And it kind of fails to make this distinction that Richard Stallman made very clear, that in open source, free is not free as free beer, but free as free speech. And that it doesn't give us the claim to exploit people's work and kind of not get it for free, basically. And the second part, this also implies that designing a house suddenly becomes so easy and everybody can do it. And I think it's really ignoring the value of design and the value of all the people who have spent their lives basically to become skilled in this particular domain. I mean, putting together an oversized puzzle is not the same as designing something. So it takes much more skill and preoccupation, and the conception of design, it's so much more than just selecting components and putting them, piecing them together. And finally, even when we see this on the very practical scale, it's still something that it requires, even on the level of craftsmanship, it requires specific skills. And it's not that because the technology is there, we suddenly everybody automatically knows how to use it. This thing, it also takes time to learn, and it also takes a lot of fails. So. Why would you bother somehow, or why would it make so much difference to spend a lot of time, a lot of wasted material, a lot of tries to make something when you can conveniently buy it? So what will it take to have a real paradigm shift on that level? And of course, when we look at it on a much broader social scale, it's very much about how the maker movement is turning into a maker industry. And Ania said before about all this proliferation of publications and stores and this whole hype about giving you the new tools, the new materials, the new everything. So it's just how does the actual values of the maker movement are being surrendered to kind of existing exploitative structures, where it's basically the whole idea of doing things yourself is being commercialized, and it's put forward as a way of entrepreneurial recovery of the city. So it's something that really fits perfectly with this whole neoliberal idea of the creative city, where city governors, they have to sort of capitalize, and that means basically they have to exploit the creative ideas and the whole drive of their citizens to make their own stuff.
Yeah, and also while we were preparing this presentation, we came across a critique that Evgeny Morozov gave towards the arts and crafts movement of the 1900s. And I would briefly just like to read a quote of his, which we think perfectly relates to our times as well. He said, "Arts and crafts movement of the early 1900s, which in this time touted amateur crafting as a force for personal autonomy and liberation. The idea was that do-it-yourself craft projects would help overcome the alienation of industrial production and provide a basis for political transformation. As some critics at the time pointed out, however, the real problems were economic inequality and corporate power, something that the craft ethic and individual project could never overcome on their own." So we think there is a very direct parallel between what this quote is stating towards a movement that seems so far away, but at the same time seems so similar to what we call today the maker movement. And we have to remember that, as Cristina mentioned before, this idea of fitting hand in glove, this idea of the creative city, creative industry, and all of this came with, from the culture that is also bringing along with it all of the stereotypes, the problems of racism, classism, sexism, and so on. And if we look at the maker movement really closely, the average maker is a white male, middle-class male. So, you know, like if we're looking at the actual possibility of the technology to address this like truly democratizing potential, we have to look really far beyond that, and we cannot be lured by looking only to the object, but we have to look at how the, let's say, institutional spectrum and how the social spectrum, the relationships and the connections that are there relate to each other, and that it does not become just a smokescreen. Towards the end, I would like to relate it to a theory, or let's say like an opinion that Michel Bauwens puts forward. He's the founder of P2P Foundation. And basically what he is explaining is that we are moving from the time where we focused only on the extraction of value towards the time that we start to bring more attention to the creation of value. And that's a positive, let's say, direction to look into, but they will never, one will never replace the other, so we should not look at it as something that is going to like completely revolutionize the world, and that they will exist together as parallel processes. And what is important to see in that transition is that, if you can go to the next slide, if we look at these three, let's say, parties that have to, be included in thinking about how these transitions happen, and we have to look at the civil society, like this idea of ethical economy, where I think the maker movement exists on that level, but it's completely omitting the idea of the partner state and the larger scale. And we think that this is something that has to be addressed in that context, which is missing out of the discussion right now. And to finish, we would like to close with a quote of David Harvey, again, that relates to the right to the city, is that the question of what kind of city we want to have cannot be divorced from what kind of social ties, relationship to nature, and lifestyle technologies and aesthetic values we actually desire. Thank you.